screen opens to silence. Then, a distant rumble grows not thunder, but the fading echo of B-29 bombers retreating into the sky. Below, a Japanese village lies in shambles. Roof beams charred black jut upward like broken bones. Tatami mats smolder in the open air. Families sit huddled in the ruins, clothes streaked with ash, faces stiff from fear. A father digs frantically at rubble with bare hands, hoping to find a family heirloom. A mother clutches her infant to her chest, rocking on her knees beside the wreckage of what was once her home. The contradiction hits like a jolt. Just yesterday, these same homes were flattened by American bombs, entire neighborhoods erased in firestorms. Yet today, the ground trembles again, not from bombs, but from boots. U.S. soldiers march into the wreckage. The villagers brace themselves. For months, they had been told that Americans were devils, invaders who would mock their suffering, take what little food remained, and leave them to die beneath open skies. But then something impossible unfolds. The soldiers set aside their rifles. They begin unloading bundles of lumber, sheets of corrugated tin, and crates of nails. Hammers ring out across the ruins. Where walls had crumbled, new wooden frames rise. Where roofs had collapsed, planks are carefully fitted. Children peer from behind their mothers' kimonos, watching wide-eyed as men in foreign uniforms, the very men blamed for the destruction, bend their backs to rebuild. The villagers whisper in disbelief. One elder murmurs that perhaps this is a cruel trick, a show staged before a harsher blow, but when he sees a young American soldier kneel to offer water to a Japanese child, the elder falls silent. Another woman recalls the firestorm that consumed her neighborhood, and now she hears the strange rhythm of hammers replacing the chaos of explosions. It is a sound she never imagined she would associate with the enemy. The camera lingers on a single detail, a soldier's hand, rough with calluses, lifting a wooden beam onto his shoulder. Sweat rolls down his temple as he steadies the frame of a roof for a family that only hours before had cursed his name. And then comes the question, simple, yet haunting. Why would the very hand that destroyed now begin to rebuild? If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And share with us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time of day is it right now? What? The year is 1945. Japan has been brought to its knees after months of relentless bombing raids, from Tokyo to Osaka, Nagoya to Kobe. The statistics are staggering: more than 60 Japanese cities devastated, hundreds of thousands dead, and nearly 9 million people left homeless. In March alone, during the infamous Tokyo firebombing, over 100,000 civilians perished in a single night. Entire neighborhoods, once bustling with tea shops, shrines, and wooden homes, were turned into seas of ash. For ordinary families, survival meant clinging to whatever scraps of shelter could be found. Some dug pits in the ground and covered them with cloth. Others huddled under railroad bridges or inside burned-out factories. Mothers tried to cook rice with melted rainwater, while children foraged for weeds along the edges of bomb craters. For them, the war had become an endless winter of hunger and fear. The Japanese government, drained of resources, often left civilians abandoned. Officials focused on military production and defense, offering little aid to the families who had lost everything. Rumors spread through villages that the Americans, when they finally landed, would behave like monsters, stealing food, tearing apart homes, and humiliating the defeated. Women were warned to hide, children told never to look a soldier in the eye. And then came the occupation. In September 1945, the first waves of U.S. troops landed not as rampaging invaders, but as occupiers bound by orders to stabilize the nation. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo laid out a vision to disarm the Japanese military, but keep the civilians alive. Rebuilding became a priority, not just for the sake of compassion, but also to prevent disease, rebellion, and social collapse. In cities like Yokohama, engineers in olive green uniforms unloaded cargo ships filled with construction materials. In villages near Kyoto, soldiers distributed corrugated metal sheets, nails, and planks of pine, step by step. These supplies found their way into the hands of carpenters, sometimes Japanese, sometimes American. The sight was surreal. The very enemy who had burned their homes from the sky now appeared on the ground with timber and hammers. One diary, recovered from a family in Nagoya, recorded the moment in blunt, emotional words I prepared to spit at them. Instead, I watched them hammer the first post. My son laughed when they lifted the roof beam. I could not stop my tears. How can a demon build a home? The disbelief was not only among civilians. Some American soldiers, too, felt the weight of contradiction. A young private from the 8th Army wrote to his mother in Kansas, "Yesterday I saw the ruins we made. Today I saw the people live in them. I thought we were here to guard, but instead, I spent my day carrying boards for a Japanese widow. I don't know what to think anymore." The camera pans slowly across a rebuilt roof in Osaka. Smoke still rises in the distance, but under that roof, a child falls asleep, no longer shivering in the open air. It is a fragile beginning, the first hint of something larger than war. For weeks after the surrender, the Japanese people lived with grim expectations. Families told themselves they would endure months, perhaps years, without roofs over their heads, in their minds. The war had stripped away every possibility of kindness. Survival would mean blankets spread beneath the stars, children wrapped in thin rags, rice doled out one handful at a time. The shock of defeat was not just military, it was personal, and it pressed down on each household like a second bombardment. Mothers whispered to their children that they must be strong, that winter would soon come, and that no one would come to their aid. Grandfathers remembered the days of the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, when neighbors had huddled together in parks for weeks after their homes collapsed. Now, they braced for something even harsher, homelessness not caused by nature, but by human firestorms. In towns across Honshu, families scavenged. Charred beams were stacked into makeshift walls. Pieces of tin roofing were tied with rope to keep out the rain. There were stories of men breaking apart shrines to salvage the wooden planks, ashamed but desperate to keep their families sheltered. The atmosphere was one of resignation. The enemy had come, and surely the enemy would not care whether civilians froze under open skies. That was the expectation that hardened with every cold night. But then the rhythm of hammers replaced the silence. Soldiers moved among the ruins not with bayonets drawn, but with toolkits slung over their shoulders. In one village outside Yokohama, a crowd gathered to watch a group of GIs raise a wooden skeleton of a house in less than 2 days. The villagers stood as if watching a ghost story unfold. Children clung to their mothers' sleeves, some weeping, others laughing nervously, unable to understand how soldiers could build instead of destroy. One widow in Osaka later recalled in her journal, "I prepared to cover my children's eyes. I thought the men in green would take what little we had, but they gave me nails, then showed me how to hammer them." That was the day I realized the war had changed forever. The expectations of despair cracked open in that moment. What had seemed impossible, an enemy soldier helping to lift a roof beam, became undeniable reality. And yet the reversal was not only material, it was psychological. For a population trained to see Americans as Oni demons, this quiet labor forced a reevaluation. If the destroyer could build, then perhaps life after war might hold more than starvation and ruins. As dusk fell over one newly raised house in Nagoya, a child's laughter echoed inside its unfinished walls. It was the first laughter heard on that street since the bombs fell, and to the families listening in the dark, it sounded like a miracle. The air was thick with suspicion. For every nail driven into a beam, there lingered the unspoken question, why are they doing this? Families stood at a distance, wary, their faces shadowed by mistrust, even as the wooden frames of new houses rose from the ashes. The fear persisted that this was a trick, some hidden cruelty to be revealed later. Japanese civilians had grown up on propaganda that painted Americans as barbarians, heartless and merciless. Children were taught that U.S. soldiers would slaughter without hesitation. So when soldiers exchanged rifles for hammers, the silence was not relief, but confusion. Many waited for the cruelty they had been promised. It never came. Instead came gestures that seemed almost impossible. A sergeant paused his men to let an elderly woman carrying water pass by unbothered. A private set down his hammer to share his rations, a can of peaches with 2 barefoot children staring at him from a distance. Another soldier knelt to help an old man balance a beam too heavy for his frail arms. These were not the acts of demons. These were the quiet, wordless offerings of men who had seen enough ruin. In one village near Kyoto, Whispers spread of an officer who refused to allow his men to occupy a half-burned shrine, declaring it a place of spirit and insisting they pitch their tents elsewhere. To the Japanese, this was bewildering gossip. Could it be that the conquerors showed more reverence for their heritage than their own wartime leaders had? The tension, however, did not evaporate overnight. Mothers still kept their daughters hidden, peering through cracks in the walls to watch the labor unfold. Old men sat with arms crossed, refusing to thank the Americans, even as they accepted sheets of tin for roofing. The contradiction was too large, too bitter to swallow quickly. Yet silence began to replace suspicion. The hammering became a steady rhythm, echoing across ruined streets. Children began to draw closer, first in timid steps, then daring to help lift small planks, laughter, hesitant at first, mixed with the metallic ring of nails, and slowly. The idea that these soldiers might be builders as well as destroyers began to settle into the minds of those who watched. One American corporal later confided in his diary, "They looked at us like wolves at first, but when the house stood, the old man bowed. It was a bow so small I nearly missed it, but I felt it more than any salute I ever earned." That bow, invisible to most, carried more weight than a speech. It was a simple suspicion yielding not to trust, but to silence, and silence yielding to the faintest acknowledgement that enemies were, at least for a moment, neighbors. The sound of hammers was not an isolated gesture. Behind every plank and beam stood a staggering machine of logistics. Between September 1945 and the spring of 1946, U.S. forces unloaded more than 500,000 tons of supplies into Japanese ports. Among the shipments were not just military rations and fuel, but also timber, corrugated iron, and tools. In Tokyo alone, American engineers supervised the distribution of over 30,000 prefabricated housing units, a number almost unthinkable in a country still reeling from starvation and rubble. General MacArthur's occupation headquarters issued precise orders, stabilized the civilian population. Disease and homelessness threatened to spiral into rebellion, and so the logic was both humanitarian and strategic, yet on the ground. What the villagers saw was simpler. They saw lumber carried down streets that had been incinerated weeks before. They saw sheets of tin flashing in the sun where once there had only been ashes. In Osaka, U.S., Army records list over 12,000 Japanese civilians receiving shelter assistance within 6 months. In Yokohama, engineers organized work brigades that paired American GIs with local carpenters, rebuilding entire blocks. Some soldiers admitted in letters home that the irony was not lost on them. "We came here trained to kill, but this week I built more homes than my father ever did in Ohio for the Japanese families." The scale was overwhelming. One mother described her disbelief in a letter preserved by her grandchildren. "I stood in line for rice, and when I returned, the soldiers had repaired my roof. My son asked if they were really foreigners. I had no answer." Gossip ran through markets and temples. Some whispered that Americans rebuilt to ease their own guilt, others that it was a clever strategy to win hearts. But as the numbers grew, tens of thousands sheltered. Entire neighborhoods raised from the ruins, the speculation mattered less than the undeniable results. People slept under new roofs. Children laughed in courtyards once blackened by flame. And here lies the paradox. The Japanese government, exhausted and defeated, often had no resources to offer its own citizens, yet the enemy arrived with timber, nails, and organization. For some, the deepest bitterness came not from the destruction of bombs, but from the shame of realizing that strangers in uniform showed more practical care than their own leaders. So let me ask you, the viewer, if you were a civilian in 1945, would you have accepted help from the very soldiers who burned your home, or would pride have kept you in the ruins? Tell us in the comments. Your perspective today shapes how we understand those choices then. By the winter of 1945, new homes dotted the ruins of once thriving neighborhoods. Roofs glimmered with fresh tin. Walls, rough and simple, stood where only ashes had remained. From a distance, these structures looked fragile, as if one strong wind might topple them. Yet for the families who stepped inside, they were monuments, proof that life could be reclaimed, if only piece by piece. A rebuilt home did more than shield against the cold. It restored a sense of rhythm. Mothers boiled rice on small stoves without fear of the rain dousing their fire. Children woke to the creak of doors instead of the howl of wind. Fathers, once broken by despair, found dignity in mending windows and sweeping floors. Every nail and beam carried meaning far heavier than its weight. Still, the memories of fire never vanished. Even as laughter returned to courtyards, the smell of charred wood lingered in the air. A grandmother in Nagoya later recalled when I heard hammering. I remembered bombs, when I saw roofs. I remembered flames falling from the sky. The house was new, but my heart remained split between terror and gratitude. The psychological fracture was permanent. Children who grew up beneath these reconstructed roofs carried two memories at once: the fear of being hunted from the sky and the bewilderment of seeing enemies build walls for them. Some never spoke of it aloud. Others told the story again and again, as if to remind themselves it had truly happened. The contrast with tradition deepened the wound. Before the war, a Japanese home was not only shelter, but a symbol of ancestry. The place where family altars and ancestral tablets rested. To lose such a space was to lose connection with the past. Yet to have it rebuilt by foreign soldiers introduced a new, uneasy future. What did it mean when the very image of family survival was tied to the hands of outsiders? For some, it became a bridge to reconciliation. For others, it was a lifelong scar, a reminder that their government had failed them, and that strangers had, paradoxically, preserved them. And so I want to turn this question to you. If your childhood home were destroyed, would you remember longer the horror of its loss, or the strange mercy of those who helped you rebuild? Which memory would shape you more deeply? The camera fades to the image of a child placing a paper lantern in front of a newly built house. The lantern glows in the dusk, fragile and bright, a symbol of survival and contradiction all at once. In the months that followed, the contradictions hardened into memories too vivid to forget. American soldiers continued their work in quiet routines, repairing beams, setting doors on hinges, sharing scraps of food with children who hovered nearby. What began as suspicion slowly turned into something else, a silent acknowledgement that enemies had, in some way, become neighbors. There were moments that lingered like photographs etched into memory. In a village outside Osaka, a small boy placed an origami crane into the calloused hand of a U.S. private who had just finished nailing the roof of his family's house. The soldier tucked it carefully into his pocket, later writing that it was the most precious gift he carried during the entire occupation. In another town, a mother lit incense before a new household altar and, before bowing, placed a bowl of rice in front of the soldiers who had carried lumber up the hillside to rebuild her home. The gesture was wordless, but the meaning was unmistakable for the soldiers. 2. These encounters altered perception. A corporal confessed in a letter, "I came here expecting hate. Instead, I was handed tea by a woman whose house we burned. I do not know how to understand that kind of grace." To these men, the act of building did more than repair homes. It chipped away at the certainty of war's divisions. Yet the paradox never lost its sting. Each new wall built stood as a reminder of the walls once shattered. Each nail hammered was also an echo of the bombs dropped. The villagers carried both truths at once: grief for what had been destroyed, and astonishment at who had helped them survive. As spring returned in 1946, the rebuilt houses filled with the ordinary sounds of life: chopsticks against bowls, laughter of children, the soft strum of shamisen. The echoes of war still haunted the skies, but within those walls, a fragile peace began to take root. And so we are left with one haunting image: a child asleep beneath a roof rebuilt by the very hands that once destroyed it, dreaming not of bombs, but of tomorrow. History often remembers wars through their battles, their generals, their maps stained with red arrows. But what lingers in the lives of ordinary people are smaller moments: the smell of ash in the morning, the creak of a door that should not exist after firestorms, the sound of children laughing in places where silence once reigned. For Japanese families in 1945, survival was not measured only in rations or statistics, but in the quiet miracle of seeing their homes rise again, plank by plank, under the hands of those they had been taught to hate. The paradox is almost unbearable. Bombs fell from the same skies that later delivered lumber. The very uniforms that symbolized terror became, for a fleeting moment, the uniforms of builders. Families who expected to be abandoned instead found roofs above their heads. roofs that carried the echo of hammer blows and the memory of foreign sweat. These gestures did not erase grief, they did not bring back the dead, nor restore the burned family shrines, but they planted something unexpected, a fragile sense that humanity could survive even in the aftermath of devastation, years later. Elders recalled these contradictions with voices both bitter and grateful. Some could never forgive, while others chose to remember the sound of hammers over the roar of bombs. For the children who grew up beneath those rebuilt roofs, the memory became part of their identity, a reminder that compassion sometimes arrives in the most unlikely of disguises. Perhaps that is the lesson that reaches across time to us today. Wars can destroy houses, cities, nations, but acts of humanity, however small, can rebuild faith where none should exist. A home is more than wood and nails. It is memory, survival, and hope proof that even enemies can leave behind something other than ruins.